So, what is the first cocktail that you should make as a beginner home bartender? My name is Ron Virpin. I'm a full time medical doctor. I've been a home bartender for over 5 years now, and I teach other busy professionals how to make cocktails at home. And this is a common question that I often get asked by beginner home bartenders. What's the ideal first cocktail to make? And for me personally, I actually have two answers, two pretty good answers. They're somewhat biased, so take that what you will. I'll get into those later in the video. But first, I want to give you two main general principles about what makes the ideal first cocktail. The first principle we're going to go over in this video is the exact amount of ingredients for the ideal first cocktail. In my opinion, the ideal amount of ingredients for a first cocktail for a beginner home bartender is 3. And there's a couple of reasons for that. In this exact case, the Goldilocks principle is ideal. You don't want too few ingredients. You don't want too many ingredients. You want the right amount of ingredients. I found over my personal experience over the years that 3 is the ideal amount for the perfect first cocktail that you're going to make. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, let's go over why less than 3 is actually too few. If you only have one ingredient, you can't even call yourself a cocktail. And then if you only have 2 ingredients, there are some good cocktails with that, like the Rusty Nail, for example, which has drambuie and scotch, or the Rum and Coke, which is just literally rum and Coke, as the name implies. And even with that, there is somewhat of a philosophical debate about whether you can call it a cocktail if it only has 2 ingredients. And you could argue also that 2 is too simple. I actually like both of those cocktails and a few other examples that have. I like a few other drinks that only have 2 ingredients. But there is that philosophical debate: is it truly a cocktail? You're only combining 2 ingredients. Is that really enough practice for you to call yourself a home bartender? So I try to avoid that and just say 3 ingredients is the ideal amount. And then on the other side, when you have too many, even just 4, and certainly 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, that's when you get into the realm of, okay, that's too many ingredients. And it does a lot of things in terms of increasing the barrier of entry. Because when you're a beginner home bartender, the thing you want to do most of all is to lower the barrier to entry to just getting started. Because once you make your first cocktail, that's really when you get the momentum, and then you can keep going. You can make your next cocktail and your next cocktail. You can serve them to others. You can host a party. And then once you start that momentum up, like I did when I first started this journey in June 2020, it really essentially becomes like a snowball going downhill on a snowy mountain. You're just picking up steam. You're adding more snow, and the snowball continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's when you can really build out your repertoire as a home bartender. So you want to get started as quickly as possible. So I found that 3 ingredients is the ideal amount. When you have more ingredients than that, it increases the barrier of entry in a number of ways. It increases the amount of ingredients that you have to buy, which increases the amount of time that you spend at the liquor store and the grocery store. It increases the cost of buying those ingredients. It increases the complexity when you're trying to learn their recipe. When you're making the drink itself, it also increases the complexity and increases the actual time that it takes to make the drink, because you're pouring 1 extra ingredient or 2 or 3 or even more extra ingredients. So because of all those reasons, once you go above 3, tons of great cocktails, tons of cocktails that I recommend when you're a month or 6 months, a year into your journey. But when you're first getting started, just stick to cocktails that only have 3 ingredients. So that's why I found that 3 is the ideal amount of ingredients for your very first cocktail. And that's the first principle. How many ingredients should be in your first cocktail? The second principle actually is which category of cocktail should you make. I found that there's generally 3 main categories of cocktails, and really it goes based on the timeline in which these drinks were created. And the 3 broad categories are classic, modern classic, and craft. And that's a chronologic order from oldest to newest. So the one that I recommend the most is classic cocktail, as opposed to modern classics or craft. So let's talk about the other 2 categories first. Craft cocktails are the newest cocktails, and they're cocktails that are so unique that they're only made at that specific bar that's serving that drink. So if you're going to a really nice cocktail bar and they have something on the menu and you've never seen that name before, that's a craft cocktail. Only that bar makes it. Me personally, I've been in this journey for a while. I've also have several recipes of drinks that I make that nobody else makes. So I've even created some craft cocktails on my own. The reason I don't think those are great for beginner bartenders is because those recipes are unique to that bar or that restaurant, or in my case, like that person that's teaching you. So those drinks are not well known, and also you probably don't even have access to the recipe because if it's a high-end cocktail bar, only that bar knows the recipe. So you don't have access to the recipe. Oftentimes they use pretty unique ingredients. Instead of just basic simple syrup, they'll have something like a rosemary vanilla syrup or something like that. And they'll have these more elaborate ingredients that are just harder to prepare, harder to acquire, things like that. So for those reasons, I think craft cocktails, because you don't know the recipe, because other people that you're serving the drinks won't know what the drink is, and then finally, because some of the ingredients to acquire them is actually pretty time intensive and maybe labor intensive, cost intensive. For all those reasons, that's why I think craft cocktails are not the ideal first cocktail. The second category is modern classics. These are drinks that came about after the whole cocktail renaissance of the early 2000s. So generally the timeline is that they're from probably around the year 2000 until now. There's quite a few good examples. Most of them were invented in the New York City bar scene of the early 2000s. Things like the paper plane or the penicillin, which are both from the mid 2000s. The Oaxacan old fashioned. A lot of these are actually my favorite drinks because they are built off of the classic cocktails and they just made them better, in my opinion. But the reason I don't recommend them is because some of the same reasons as the craft cocktails. Oftentimes they contain more ingredients than their classic counterparts, and oftentimes those ingredients are harder to acquire. For example, I think the penicillin is the modern classic version of the whiskey sour, and I think it's much better than the whiskey sour. But the whiskey sour is way easier to make because it has fewer ingredients, and those ingredients are easier to acquire in terms of both the time it takes to acquire them and the cost that you need to buy those ingredients. So if you love the penicillin, then the whiskey sour is its classic cocktail equivalent. Make that instead. It won't be as good, but in my opinion, it's a great beginner cocktail and it'll really get you into this journey. Then once you're deep into your journey, you're a couple months in, you made some cocktails, then you can start progressing and then make the penicillin at some point in the near future. But for your first cocktail, stick with the classic cocktails. So that's why I think modern classics are also not as good, because compared to classic cocktails, their recipes are often more complex, have more ingredients, and are just harder to make technically as well. So even though I think a lot of them are great, they're still much harder to make than the classic cocktails. So in the classic cocktails, I think those are actually the ideal choice for your first cocktail. These are cocktails that have been around since at least 1950. Oftentimes they're from the very early part of the 1900s and sometimes even the late 1800s. And the reason I think these are great cocktails to make, one is that oftentimes they're pretty much all the time, they're very simple. They only use 3 ingredients, maybe 4 ingredients on some of them. And the technique is also relatively simple. The ingredients are these days readily available, easy to acquire, not super expensive. So for those reasons, I think classic cocktails are great. And the other main reason I think classic cocktails are great for beginners is because of something called the Lindy effect. And the Lindy effect essentially applies to anything that's non-living. So things like ideas, concepts, or in this case, recipes for cocktails. What it says is that if something has been around for a very long time, that means that it's going to be around for even longer. So essentially with non-living things, what it means is that if something's lifespan is a predictor of how, it actually says that it'll live longer. If it's had a long lifespan, that means it'll live longer. And that's in contrast to living things like humans, animals, or plants. Whereas, with living things, when you live for a long time, that means your lifespan is actually going to be shorter. You're not going to live for much longer. But with something like recipes for cocktails, if a cocktail's been around since the 1920s, that means it's been around for 100 years. That means it's still going to be around for the rest of our lifetime. People are still going to be enjoying it and enjoying that drink. So when you're learning this drink, you're not only learning it for today, you're learning it for the rest of your lifetime, the rest of your career as a home bartender. So if you learn that recipe now, you can then make that same recipe in 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, because that drink is still going to be popular then. That's not necessarily true for the modern classic and the craft cocktails. Those drinks are popular right now in the moment. You don't know if people are still going to be into that drink 20, 30, 40 years from now. So that's why I think classic cocktails are the ideal first cocktail. Now, with those recommendations in mind, there's a lot of great options for where your first cocktail can be. I have 2 pretty much biased options, but I think they're both great options for you. The first is the Negroni. The reason I say that's biased is because the Negroni is actually the very first cocktail that I made. And it does meet both of these requirements. It only has 3 ingredients: Campari, sweet vermouth, and gin. And it's also a classic cocktail. It's been around for about 100 years, maybe even slightly more. The exact origins are a little bit unclear. But because of those reasons, it's stood the test of time, and the Negroni, even in 2025, is actually quite popular. So it's a classic cocktail, has only 3 ingredients. For me personally, it was the first drink that I made, so I think it's a great option. The other great option that I recommend is the daiquiri. The reason that's biased is because the daiquiri is the very first video on my channel, and I did that intentionally. I actually think that if I was to start this home bartending journey all over again, the daiquiri would be the first drink that I make. A couple of reasons for that. First of all, it fits those 2 criteria. It's a classic cocktail, been around since the early 1900s. People are still going to be drinking it, not only in 2025, but many years from now as well. Other reason, it only has 3 ingredients: rum, lime juice, simple syrup. All those ingredients are readily available, easy to acquire, not very expensive, things like that. So the other main reason is that it's a sour. There are different categories of cocktails in terms of the ingredient list, and sours is probably the biggest category of cocktails, especially for home bartenders. I know for me personally, of all the cocktails that are in my repertoire, sours make up the biggest category. And the daiquiri is the prototypical beginner sour cocktail to make. So I think those 2 are great first options. Honestly, you can go with any classic cocktail that has only 3 ingredients. So I mentioned earlier in this video, the whiskey sour, that's another great option. Manhattan is another great option. So there's plenty out there that you can make. Me personally, I recommend the Negroni because it was the first one that I made, and I recommend the daiquiri because it's the first video on my YouTube channel. And those 2 things were intentional. I didn't just randomly choose a cocktail to start my channel with. I didn't just randomly choose a cocktail to start my home bartending journey with. I chose them intentionally because it has those 2 criteria that I talked about in this video. So if you're having this question, you're a beginner home bartender, you want to know what's the ideal first cocktail that I should make. In my opinion, it should be either the daiquiri or it should be the Negroni. But if you don't personally like any of those cocktails, then go with something else that meets those 2 criteria. Something that has only 3 ingredients, and then something that's a classic cocktail, meaning the recipe is at least 1950 or older, ideally from the early part of the 1900s or even the late 1800s. So as long as your cocktail has those criteria, it's a great first cocktail. If you're still unsure, comment down below. I can give you some tips and advice on what your first cocktail should be. So if you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel. I'll be making tons more videos on different tips and tricks for home bartenders, beginner home bartenders, and more advanced home bartenders as well. And I also do specific tutorials teaching you guys how to make specific cocktails at home. Thank you. Cheers.